Thanks for coming along tonight, folks. Where the Honourable Joel Fitzgibbon makes a welcome return to the Sydney Institute. He was here during the period of the Labor government. He's well known, so I'll introduce him briefly. Trained as an auto electrician, became a tradesman, ran a small business, was also a TAFE teacher, and then the Labor member for Hunter from 1996, and during the previous Labor government held the positions of Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Forest, and of course the Minister for Defence. And it was great to have Joel Fitzgibbon back here, and the topic for tonight's talk is "The World is Moving While Australia Stands Still." Joel Fitzgibbon, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jared, for the generous introduction, and it is nice to be back. I'm not sure what I did wrong the first time. It has taken me 10 years to be invited again, so I'll try to do a better job this time, Jared. And it's great to see Terry Sheen here, because I just said to him, I remember very vividly him being here the last time I addressed the Institute. So you bring me sort of continuity, Terry. Continuity. And yes, Jared, I did invoke the politician's prerogative of changing the title of my speech, and I apologise for that, but I'm going to tell you a little story. I had dinner with a good mate of mine. You notice I say mate in the finest of the tradition of the New South Wales Right, and it's great to see Michael Forshaw here. He's one of my fellow travellers. And I dined with Laurie Bratton, and I just mentioned for some reason I was coming here exactly a week later, and he said, well, what are you going to say there? And I explained that I was going to make this quite wonky speech about global change and the implications for our economy, and in particular the implications for the resources and agriculture sectors, which of course are now my portfolio responsibility, and in particular the challenges and opportunities for the agriculture sector, because in my view, sadly, I think the challenges massively outweigh the opportunities, but I'll save that for 10 years' time when I come back to the Institute again, Jared. And he said, why would you want to do that? And a bit taken back, I said, what do you mean? He said, they don't want to hear that. They said they want to hear Joel Fitzgibbon, the politician, talking about the election outcome, what's taken place since, the future for Labor, and the opportunities to take government again. And I thought, well, that may be right. So if my contribution tonight is one which you look upon fondly, I take all the credit. And if it's terrible, you blame Laurie Bratton. It's as simple as that. But, you know, there has been a hell of a lot of analysis about what happened on May 18, about 4 months, in about the 4-month period since. And that's hardly surprising because it was an upset result, a result that went against all the predictions of the pundits and, of course, infamously now, the opinion polls. And I'll start by saying that the first lesson opposition parties should take from May 18 is that being up against an underperforming and underwhelming government is not sufficient to guarantee government or a victory. And that's certainly true. The truth is Labor confused the electorate. We made ourselves the target when we should have just been leaving people free to think about a 6-year-old government and a government with very little record of achievement. The second lesson people should learn is that we should never underestimate our opponents. And I never saw any sign that key Labor strategists changed direction or took Scott Morrison seriously after he took the leadership from Malcolm Turnbull. And certainly I didn't see any substantial change in tactics, either in strategic terms or indeed in policy terms. Now you might ask why this was a mistake. Well, because while Malcolm had some redeeming features, in my view, a politician he was not. Scott Morrison, by contrast, he's a very different beast. He's a professional politician. He's been around the Liberal Party for a long time. He understands its culture. and he understands its power dynamics. He is of the party and he knows how to harness power within the party. And he certainly harnessed it in a way Malcolm Turnbull hadn't never been able to do, and I think that's because Malcolm was never really of the culture. He was never really of the party. In a sense, he was a newcomer to the Liberal Party. And Scott Morrison, in my view, by stark contrast to Malcolm, doesn't really care if people think he's the smartest person in the room. He's a sort of whatever it takes sort of guy. He just wants to win. And I think you'd agree that he was very determined to win this election. Now, his campaign was a very simple one, and it was based, in my view, on three very, very simple messages. The first was, Labor's policy package is a threat to people's economic security. Pretty simple. His second message, Labor is putting progressive causes ahead of the rights of people of faith and ahead of traditional values. His third message was, the coalition promises not to change anything much. And I think that was possibly the most powerful of them all. Now, I don't want to dwell on the first message because that would sound like a bit of a whinge. Suffice to say, and I've said it before publicly, that if you invite upon yourself a scare campaign, that's exactly what you can expect. That's exactly what we received, and we received it in spades. On faith, I should say, faith remains a very, very important part of the lives of a very substantial number of Australians. And he understood that and he exploited that. He could see Labor's progressive instincts were overwhelming his sensibilities on religious respect. He exploited that weakness. But it's the third message, a promise to do nothing or not much, that I want to dwell on for just a few moments. Many have begun to compare Scott Morrison to Donald Trump. Now, that's hardly surprising because Scott Morrison encourages people to compare himself with Donald Trump. He certainly has done his very best to sound and look like Donald Trump at every opportunity. In the bubble is Scott Morrison's version of fake news. Now, we don't want to talk about that, that's in the bubble. Donald Trump says, no, we're not talking about that, that's fake news. How good is Australia? Is Scott Morrison's equivalent of let's make America great again. Scott Morrison's trip to Ohio to join the president at what was in effect an election campaign rally painted the picture I believe Scott Morrison was looking for, standing along Donald Trump on stage in front of all those banners and in front of all those people, just the picture he was looking for. Last week, he went a bit further when he joined in on the US president's unbridled attack on the global institutions and frameworks that have laid the foundation of much of Australia's economic success, in my view. These are views, by the way, Scott Morrison never expressed prior to May 18, or indeed never expressed prior to his visit to Washington. And I find that really interesting. And I'm sure you will agree that they are views which have historically only been expressed by minor parties like One Nation or their international equivalents. And in joining with the President in making China's WTO status an issue, he has failed to clearly articulate what in fact, or how in fact Australia is being disadvantaged by that status. How changing that status will benefit Australia. We all know what it means to the United States, but the Prime Minister hasn't, in my view, made the case that China's WTO status is doing Australia economic harm. Remember, we do have a free trade agreement with them. So we've heard Scott Morrison sounding like Donald Trump, and of course, in my view, he's doing this because he doesn't have a domestic agenda beyond fear and division and beyond splitting Australian against Australian. His big challenge, though, in my view, is sustaining this strategy because he's not really like Donald Trump when you think about it. The President's main and consistent message has been one of change. He is constantly challenging the status quo and the political orthodoxy, constantly. It's a style many in the past have called nostalgic conservatism. That is a romanticised promise to take us back to earlier glory days, the things we used to know, the things we used to be familiar with, the things we used to like. Donald Trump is a populist for sure, but I put it to you, he's no conservative in the true sense of the word. Conservatives resist change, but in fact, Donald Trump is a change agent. He spends all of his time trying to change the status quo. And I'll put it to you that Scott Morrison is a completely different beast. Scott Morrison is a conservative with a capital C. Despite his more recent global adventurism, his main cut-through message throughout the election campaign, and indeed since, has been that promise to keep things just the way they are, and from his perspective, hoping just the way people like it. Now, in the midst of Labor's very, very busy and confusing messaging during the election campaign, that worked for him, and it worked really well. And maybe we should not be surprised, to paraphrase futurist and author Yuval Noah Harari, and I quote, "Today more people die from obesity than by starvation. More die from old age than from disease, and more die by accident than as a result of violence," close quote. So maybe Australians were just happy with their lot. Maybe they were happy with the status quo. Maybe they were happy to leave things just as they are. But personally, I doubt it, and I doubt it very much. I don't believe the coalition won because the status quo sounded appealing to voters. Rather, I believe they just simply chose the safer of the two options on offer. Australians are inherently conservative. A bird in hand is worth two in the bush. Better to be safe than sorry. They have long been part of the Australian vernacular, for generations, in fact. Even the most progressive amongst us can be conservative if indeed they think their financial security is being threatened, and therefore the financial security of their family are being threatened. So the no change message worked so well on May 18 because so many Australians saw a threat in Labor's suite of policies. Coal miners, for example, in my electorate were amongst them. So too were my retired coal miners. And on issues like Adani, our equivocation left us in no man's land. We didn't satisfy the left because they thought we were all for Adani, and we didn't satisfy the right because they thought we were against Adani, and we found ourselves in impossible circumstances. And we didn't like to talk about the other side of the equation with respect to some of our policies. For example, we like to talk about 50% renewables or getting to 50% renewables by 2030. But we didn't remind people that if you have 50% renewables, axiomatically the other 50% is going to come from fossil fuel sources. We didn't seek to balance it. We didn't speak to people who had traditionally supported our party. It seems that's because to do so would have been in conflict with our city-centric narrative. Now, I can't pinpoint exactly when it happened, but somewhere along the way, over the course of the last 3 years, we just stopped talking to our blue-collar base, and we paid a heavy price for it. We made another mistake in not reminding Australians that under existing settings, 4 coal-fired generators will close before 2013. Not because anything the Labor Party did, we're in opposition, but under the current policy settings of this government, 4 coal-fired power generators will close. Not only in my own electorate became an issue for the Labor Party somehow, but of course it will close on the government's watch, and on the watch of a government which has now been in power for more than 6 years. Now, in normal circumstances, I say, the no change message would have struggled. More of the sounds pretty good. More of the same sounds pretty good if you're doing okay. And the economy looks like it has the capacity to sustain your economic circumstances. But if you're struggling, which many Australians are at the moment, with flat wages and slow economic growth, then it's a different proposition. And I don't think there are too many people that back on May 18 that thought any of those things, that their economic security looked fine with respect to the trajectory of the economy. But that's what they chose to do. They played it safe. So it would be a mistake, in my view, for Labor to conclude that the message to be taken from the election is to be more like our political opponents. God forbid. Too many Australians are relying on the Labor Party to drive the policy changes needed to adapt to significant global change. So I'm a little bit on topic, Jared. So it would also be a mistake, though, to be too ambitious. Too ambitious. But we do need to remain ambitious. Which takes me to lessons 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8. I didn't think I had time to do 9 and 10. Lesson 3. Labor's path to success at the 2022 election is not to track to the right, but to track back to the sensible centre, where the majority of the electorate are. It's pretty basic stuff. We must stick to our key values, chief amongst them, equality of opportunity and reward for effort. For those falling behind, we must offer in the first instance a hand up, not a hand out, but we do need to maintain a safety net to ensure the people who fall through the cracks are protected and taken care of. And we must, it's a special topic for me, again reclaim the Hawke-Keating legacy to promote business growth, to promote the opportunity for business to thrive, to create economic activity, and of course, to create good and meaningful jobs. Lesson 4, we must be realists, not idealists. We need to respond to a changing world, but also learn to be patient and pragmatic. We need to take the electorate with us. That's what strong leadership is about. Leadership is also about remembering who we seek to represent. In our case, working people first and foremost. Those who built our great movement more than 100 years ago. And as I say it again, we must check our progressive instincts when they risk offending people of faith or people who hold traditional values and hold them very close to their hearts. This, according to some of my colleagues, cost the party very, very dearly in multicultural communities. Which takes me to lesson 5. I'm getting there. Labor needs to reach a sensible settlement on climate change. How many times as a party are we going to allow it to kill us? How many leaders do we have to lose as a result of this scrap? Australia, as I'm sure most of you know, is responsible for about 1.3% of global emissions. Nothing we do alone can make a difference. Nothing we do alone can make a difference. But we must act, because as a wealthy nation, arguably one of the most wealthy nations in the world, we have a responsibility to show leadership. And we can't be preaching to the big emitters like China and India if we are not ourselves fulfilling our international obligations, the obligations we signed. We must honour them, otherwise we have no right to lecture to others. Scott Morrison argues that reducing emissions by 26 to 28% by 2030 is sufficient to honour that Paris commitment. Well, even if that's true, today, due to inaction, government inaction, our emissions are increasing year on year and have been for the last 4 years. There is no possibility, despite what Scott Morrison and Angus Taylor say, that this government is on track to reduce emissions by 28% or even 26% by 2030. So what right can we have, or do we have, to be lecturing to the rest of the world about what they need to do to make a difference if we ourselves aren't honouring our own commitments. Now, the Prime Minister has largely avoided scrutiny on this issue because all the focus has been and remains on Labor's more ambitious targets. When the Prime Minister's asked about whether he's on track to meet his own commitments, he just simply segues into Labor, Labor, Labor. And have a look at Labor's target. It would be a disaster if Labor were ever elected because they've got this big ambitious target. Now, what would be the outcome? Think about this. If Labor offered a political settlement and simply made 28% the target for 2030, the focus would then be on them, on the government. No distraction. Prime Minister, are you on track to meet your 28% target, and can you show us what the pathway is there? And you can only avoid that question so many times if the other distraction is removed. And my view is he'd be forced to act. He'd be forced to lift his game. And of course, a political settlement would also restore investment confidence and for the first time put downward pressure on energy prices for the first time in 6 years. Restoring investor confidence is critical, and a political settlement which sent a clear message to business about what the rules will look like for the next 10, 20, 30 years would make a huge difference. It's the single biggest thing we could do to reduce energy prices. And based on recent history, 28% would be a pretty substantial outcome. I said today, if I'm 100 kilos and I drop to 70, I reckon that's a big result. By the way, I'm not 100 kilos. Well, I might be creeping my way up. But that's a pretty big outcome when you compare it to where we've been historically and where we are today, with emissions rising. 28% by 2030 is not what the Labor Party has aspired to, but it's still a pretty substantial achievement. Which takes me to lesson 6. You can't achieve much as a political party if you are perpetually in opposition. If we could get to 28% by 2030, and we also demonstrated that we can get there without costing jobs or doing any damage to the economy, then that would be a great foundation to persuade people that we can be more ambitious. We get to 28%, we say, look at that. No job losses, or few job losses, but new jobs created. Economy's still going strong. And I think the community will say, yeah, let's have another go. We can do better. But it's one step at a time, one step at a time. And what an achievement it would be if in 3 years' time we had so sufficiently turned carbon emissions around that we were on track to get to 28% 7 years after that. That would be a huge turnaround on what we've experienced in recent years. And nowhere would this be more welcome than in rural and regional Australia, where people want action, but they also want their jobs protected in industries like the coal mining industry and the coal seam gas industry. And my view absolutely is that we can take meaningful action on climate change without threatening blue-collar jobs and without threatening the coal mining or other fossil fuel industries. And remember that Labor's last policy, 45%, is not making any difference now because we're still in opposition. We can be idealist, but we need to be in government to make a difference. And imagine if Labor follows a path which delivers an opportunity for Scott Morrison to increase emissions not just for 3 years, but for another 6 years. I don't think Australia can afford to wait another 6 years before it acts on carbon emissions. Now, that takes me to lesson 7. Labor's 2019 election result was anything but uniform. We did quite well in the wealthier suburbs of the capital cities. I did very well in Wollongong, in my own electorate, an area of substantial tree change and where many professionals in Sydney are commuting. I did very well in Wollongong. I had something to be pleased about. on election night. We also did well in some of the more progressive regions, you know, on the Tweed, for example, and Queenscliff in Victoria. We did quite well in those areas. But in many regions, including the Central Coast, the Hunter, the Northern Rivers, central New South Wales, North and Central Queensland, we did very, very badly. Very, very badly. Seats, the coalition seats, which were sitting on 1, 2 and 3%, are now on 9, 10, 11%, which makes Labor's task all the more difficult in 3 years' time. Now, McKell, Rand, Carr, Hawke and Rudd all had one thing in particular in common. They knew that they couldn't win government without winning the requisite numbers of rural and regional seats, and they had strategies to get there. Clear and concise strategies to get there. Labor can't win an election, cannot win a federal election without winning those rural and regional seats. And as I say in my submission to the somewhat infamous now Election Review Committee, that's going to take a lot of cultural change within the party, new thinking and a lot of cultural change. And herein, of course, lies one of those classical chicken and the egg dilemmas. We can't get cultural change without getting more regional representatives in the caucus and around the key decision-making tables, and we can't change the culture without getting more people into the House of Representatives in particular. So it's a significant challenge for the Labor Party. I have to say that on this front I'm encouraged by the leadership of Anthony Albanese. Albo's a city boy and a Rabbitoh supporter. We don't hold that against him. But he's been in that transport and infrastructure portfolio, or was in that for, I think, more than 10 years. And he spent one hell of a lot of time in the bush. And you know, we've had many discussions about it. I've had many trips to the regions with him. He understands the regions. He understands the regional people. He appreciates the contribution the regions make to our economy, and he knows he has to get behind them, and I reckon he will. And I'll keep giving him a push along. Lesson number 8 is about parliamentary strategy. For the past 6 years, the Labor Party has spent too much time being a government in exile, saving what I think is a bad government from itself, constantly amending or blocking legislation in the Parliament for the right reasons, for the good of the Australian people, in our view. But I often joke to my colleagues that if John Howard hadn't taken control of the Senate in 2004, work choices would never have passed the Parliament and John might still be Prime Minister. John would be happy about that, and probably a few people in the room would be happy about that too. But it's true. Control of the Senate can be death, but also taking too much control of the Senate from opposition can also be political death. And I think that they may have done a lot of things over the last 6 years that would have done them enormous damage if we hadn't saved them from themselves, and I do think we need to take lessons from that. They say governments lose elections, oppositions don't win them, and that's often true, although the narrative I've been talking about is somewhat different. And I think Scott Morrison is warming up to lose the 2022 election. There's a prediction for you. A very courageous one, particularly given what I just said about some of those margins and some of those regional seats. But I say this because I think his main political message is a fiction. Well, at least it's based on a fiction. The promise that we can maintain our standard of living and our sense of security in our region by marking time, I think, is fool's gold. I don't think that's possible. The world is changing so rapidly, I don't think we can mark time. I don't think that's possible for our country. Disruption is all around us, and we do need to be agile and adaptable if we are to maintain our wealth and that standard of living. But the government has no clear policy agenda. It is clear, I think, to everyone now, it didn't expect to win the election. Amongst the few continuities for Australia, of course, the things that aren't changing so much, are the benefits which have flowed from trade liberalisation and the security offered by a rules-based global order. Yet this is the one substantial area of public policy Scott Morrison has chosen to challenge. Australia is a small, isolated trading nation. While we once rode on the sheep's back, more recently, our wealth has flowed largely from trade liberalisation and that rules-based order. The successful promotion of peace has come through those institutions, global institutions like the UN, the OECD, the World Trade Organisation. So why was our Prime Minister at the Lowy lecture a week ago talking about, and I quote, a new variant of globalism that seeks to elevate global institutions above the authority of nation states or direct national policies, close quote. Again, he wasn't clear about the threat, but his words echoed sentiments from the United States once again. In his recent address to the United Nations General Assembly, Donald Trump told the Assembly, and I quote, "The future does not belong to globalists, the future belongs to patriots. If you want democracy, hold on to your sovereignty." Now, it's a big call to make on my part, but I think eventually that will become one of the most significant things Donald Trump has said since his inauguration in 2017. And again, that's a very big call. He said a couple of things, even since I drafted this speech, that might provide some competition. But the President has now declared himself, not just himself, an isolationist. He's urging others to follow. Indeed, he has declared retreat to be part of our patriotic duty. It's a call to arms, my friends, that we should ignore. But our Prime Minister has embraced it with great enthusiasm. The one big change he's looking for is this embrace of isolationism. Now, of course, you know the US is not the only partner turning inward. And what's happening at Westminster has just left us all gobsmacked. And, of course, that springs from a nationalist push. A nationalist push a lot of people didn't see coming. And it just demonstrates again how quickly things are changing in our global community. And the Brexit referendum outcome may have been different if it was not for the complacency of those who believed they should remain but didn't turn out, didn't see it coming, didn't think it possible. And now Australia, in my view, is at risk of falling to that same complacency. A complacency which could allow Scott Morrison to take us on a sleepwalk to lower growth, lower employment, less export income, and less wealth. We should do everything in our power as a nation and as a community to persuade other key international parties or partners that that is not in our interest. That isolationism is a folly. It's certainly a folly for Australia. And I say Labor is willing to take up that fight. We're willing to lead on that front. We won't be drawn to the populism. We will maintain a steady course and protect the things that have provided us with such wealth over more recent decades. But to do that, we need to be a competitive Labor Party. We need to be a Labor Party capable of winning. And standing with Anthony Albanese, we are determined to make the Labor Party just that. Thanks for listening.
Well, many thanks indeed to the Shadow Minister for Agriculture and Resources. And so we come to questions and discussion. A very perceptive speech. A lot of people here tonight, so keep your comment or your question fairly brief. And we'll start off if you come over here, Mr. Fitzgibbon. That's great. This is not the only time it's happened to a party. It's happened to the Liberal Party. But your comment that the Labor Party in 3 years lost connection with its traditional base is a very important criticism. Now, it seems to me you come from the Hunter, and I know some Labor members from out of Sydney were not so sure about this election result. They were a bit worried. It seems to me that when you make your point is you did well in the inner city. Why was Labor focused, as you say, so much on the inner city? Because it knew it had to win other seats to hold or to win office. Was that because of the presence of the Greens threatening quite traditional Labor seats beyond the seat they currently hold of Melbourne?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Joe, and I should have apologised earlier for my voice. I've been struggling for quite a few days now. Obviously it wasn't because I was shouting for the Newcastle Knights in the grand final. They didn't make it. But you know, the Labor Party's always struggled with its dual base. For a long, long time, many decades, we've had the progressive left over here, typically found in our capital cities, but also, as I said, found in some more progressive regional communities, and of course our traditional blue-collar base, typically found in the outer suburbs or indeed in rural and regional Australia, where I spend most of our time. So this is not a new phenomenon. Maybe it's got a little bit harder because on the left, on the progressive side, we've had more contests from the Greens, and in the bush, we've had more contests from minor parties like One Nation, even though you might think they're more a threat to the Conservatives. They really hurt us in our safer Labor seats. One Nation, in my electorate, got 21% of the primary vote. And in Muswellbrook, which is coal mining heartland, they got 27% of the vote, with a candidate they hid, a candidate who didn't campaign. So, while we've always had the problem, it has got more difficult. But I think the truth is that Labor has slipped in terms of its regional representation. And I don't know whether he'll appreciate me saying it. I don't usually share private conversations, but I said to Bill throughout the campaign, look, it appears to me that you might think you can win government without the regional seats we were hoping for. But you'll be a better government if you've got regional people in your caucus. So it's that chicken and the egg I was talking about. You know, each of the times I was in the cabinet, I was the only member of the cabinet from what the AEC defines as a rural seat. And whenever I wasn't in the cabinet, there wasn't one. There were a couple of people from regional seats, or what the AEC defines as provincial seats. And you can't expect to get outcomes conducive to the thoughts of rural and regional Australians if you don't have representatives around the table. And we've got to really deeply think about that because until we address that, and until we address the cultural change that flows from that, I fear we will continue to struggle.
Question here.
Joel, you mentioned the need to address the interests of regional Australia, and obviously that's so important. You've come into a lot of press these days about your champion of the cause of drought-stricken regional Australia and the need for a calling of a national emergency, which I think is a brilliant concept, and I don't know why the government is not pursuing it. Is this because of the green and red tape that's stopping so much aid going from the government, at least, into the rural areas? Because as far as I'm aware, that most of the aid that's coming is coming from private organisations, country women's associations and other private organisations, but not from the government.
Well, people should feel free if they have the urge to call me brilliant. I don't mind. Don't mind that, thank you. Look, I've got to work out how I answer this in the shortest way possible. Something really significant, substantial happened back in 2008. The Commonwealth and the states, with the support of the National Farmers Federation and all the key and peak agricultural groups, said, we've got to tear up all this drought stuff we're doing, the exceptional circumstances arrangements. They were costing a bomb and they weren't effective, and there was a lot of moral hazard involved. So the agreement was made, and in 2012, just before Labor lost office, the COAG signed an intergovernmental agreement, and the intention then was to use the COAG committee, SCOPE, to build a new drought policy nationally, a strategic policy based on 5 key foundational points. But when Abbott was elected in 2013, he abolished the COAG committee, and there ended the reform process. And what we've had since then is sort of piecemeal ad hoc responses. And if I've learned nothing in 6 years in the agriculture portfolio, it's that country people have this amazing optimism when it comes to drought and rain. Their creed is, every day is a day closer to rain. And it's a credit to them. I don't know, it's 300 days away or 2 days away, but that's their positive approach. And I think this creeps into the National Party, which of course influences most the drought policy of the government. And I really just think they thought it was going to rain. And the Nats just thought it was going to rain. So just kick this along, put some concessional loans out there, and don't worry about it because it's going to rain. And then I thought, of course, they thought when they might have started to think it might never rain, they thought they were going to lose government. But the response to this drought has just been terrible, just terrible. And it's really offensive for the Prime Minister to constantly run around saying he's spending $7 billion on drought when he clearly is not. And I don't know who he's talking to because farmers know he's not. He gets there by counting the capital value of certain programs, like concessional loans, $2 billion of concessional loans on the table. But that's the capital value of the loans, whether they're lent or not lent. And they're not being lent because farmers don't think more debt or shuffling debt is part of the answer for them. So we've lost 6 years and we can't get that back. But, Anthony Albanese did an extraordinary thing at the Bush Summit in Dubbo. In front of Scott Morrison and hundreds of other people, he looked down at Scott and said, Prime Minister, whatever it takes, we offer a blank cheque. We will back any amount of money you want to spend. I don't know what Jim Chalmers thought about that. I'm sure he choked on his Wheaties. But Albo meant it, because he's spoken with me about it. But the Prime Minister's never really taken up the offer, and they just continue to go on. Now they're farmed out, excuse the pun, the drought policy to the NFF, which is the most extraordinary thing I've heard. Let's hope we can get some more bipartisanship into it because we've got a real problem here. And I was on a dairy farm on the weekend and it's just devastating what's happening up there.
You got the microphone, you got the call. Yeah, here.
So, thanks again. Another one of your colleagues who will be choking on his Wheaties is Mark Butler. So when you talk tonight about the 28% target and agreeing to that for really pragmatic reasons with regards to not being such a big political target, how are you going to get that through your own caucus?
Well, we are the Labor Party in an area where we're letting 1,000 flowers bloom. Are you allowed to use Chinese phrases?
Yes, you are.
Jared, these days?
If you translate them.
Under this regime. So, look, I think it's good we're having the conversation. And, look, I might, in the end, not prevail. Jacqueline, maybe Mark, who obviously has a different view, and a valid view, maybe something more attuned to what he's thinking will prevail. But I think Mark does understand that we have a political problem and that we have to be more measured and balanced in our aspirations. My view is just very, very simple. You've got to crawl before you can walk. And I think we should just join with the government in a bipartisan way and take the heat out of the thing and get to 28. If we get to 28, as I said, we can talk about something more aspirational. Ultimately, the Labor Party will have to come to a decision. I'll keep advocating my views, particularly on behalf of rural and regional Australia. Others will have different views, and we'll have a wrestle. We'll see where it takes us. And I don't think there's anything wrong with a wrestle. I think that's good for our democracy if we're having a conversation in the party about a very, very important matter.
Just looking at the world, and you're talking about the great changes and whatever, what's an interesting phenomenon in the Western democratic societies, whether you take the United States, Britain, Australia as just an example, you find that the social democrat side of politics has become increasingly pushed by a very strong left-wing agenda. Look at Labor's policy in Britain, it's wildly socialistic. And here, last election, Labor was kind of pushing for that more tax and spend kind of social government. But the result has been Trump in America, we've now got Boris Johnson in Britain, and you've got a return for the Liberals in a sort of fairly strong capitalist, on with the show as it was. So what's the problem for the Social Democrat side? Is it that you're just being pushed by younger people to a fairly extreme left-of-centre position, and how do you get that?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think there are a few points. It's hard to explain historically, but axiomatically, most of the electorate it does live in the capital cities. And so that's always been a challenge. But you've got to carve out the UK a bit, because what Jeremy Corbyn did there after 20 years of sitting on the backbench was just extraordinary. And it's more a result not of where the electorate is going, but his organisational skills, or the organisational skills of those who are behind him, of the $3 memberships, etc. So I think you've got to be careful not to read too much into it. But I think more generally, it has been the response of centre-left parties to run further to the left, where they find themselves getting most of the praise, basically. But the thing you learn about politics, if I dare steal a phrase from the Prime Minister, you got to watch the quiet people. And it's all right to get praised on Twitter, but I wouldn't describe the attitude of Twitter or those on the Twitter sphere as typical of what's happening out there in the Australian community. So I think many centre-left candidates and leaders have found themselves flattered, frankly, by extolling lots of progressive views, and they do hear a lot of applause, but I think the silent majority are thinking something very different, and we need to learn from that.
There's a question here.
You mentioned quite rightly that the world is in a certain amount of very rapid change. How much do you think politics in Australia and around the world will be affected by, I think, the organisations like the student strike and existential rebellion? Extinction Rebellion.
It's the same thing.
Look, the main objective of those protests is to get a run on the news, and it's working. And it's been working for a long time. I said yesterday in an interview, you go back to the Vietnam War, for example, that's how people made their views known. I'm not so sure they're doing their cause good by disrupting normal citizens trying to get to and from work, but it's certainly getting them the attention. And the message, of course, is that, quite clearly, the international community is not doing enough on climate change. I went to Paris and found a fancy set of words. Have you ever read? It's really worth reading, the Paris Agreement, because you can see how many hours would have been spent finding a form of words that didn't really offend anyone. It's pretty open-ended stuff. It doesn't talk about tonnages of carbon, it just talks about temperatures. But they all went there and they signed the agreement, and they basically all went home and thought they could get away with doing something less. And that's causing significant protests, and I think people are right to protest. I'm a very, very strong believer that the climate is changing dramatically. You can have the argument about what's causing it, but I'm a believer in the precautionary principle. If in doubt, do something about it, because in 10 years or 15 years' time it might just be too late. And these younger people, of course, are genuinely concerned. Of course, some of them are urged by others. Hard to know how many, but I speak with some of them. They are genuinely concerned about their future, and they are right to feel let down by our inaction.
There's a question here.
Does Labor have a plan B if the climate hysteria actually collapses? It is a globalist thing from the UN via things like Kyoto and Paris. There is a backlash. Scott Morrison's made comments about the UN. Of course, Donald Trump's much vaunted comments, and Brexit looks like coming through. Is there a plan B if the climate hysteria actually collapses?
Well, I think we just have to concentrate on things we can control. And while the global framework for pushing other countries to do something could collapse, we can only concentrate on the things that we can do ourselves here in Australia. So there need not be any plan B. Even if that architecture were to collapse, we'd have more reason to lead by example, to do what we've committed ourselves to do here in Australia, and to continue to set that example in the hope that there'd be a resurrection or a new global framework which would get us back on track. So I don't accept the premise of the question. I don't think there needs to be a plan B. There's only one plan, and the plan is to act. But again, I believe we can act in a way that doesn't do harm to our economy.
Question here.
Good evening, my name is Bill Bowman. I understand the problem you had in the last election in terms of the rural electorates, particularly anywhere near to a coal mine. I understand that's the problem. But on the other hand, though, of course, you have the example of the US and Donald Trump, a populist, who promised to bring back all the coal mining jobs, and obviously it didn't happen. And it seems to me that there's declining international demand for coal. New coal mines are having trouble with finance and getting insurance, and the ongoing issue of the mining legacy challenges coming up.
Okay, got to be brief.
Yeah, is your role as a politician to give the people what they want, or to educate the people as to what they really require?
This is the bill. This is very clever. This is the great unanswered question in democracy. Is our role to follow the majority, or our role, our privileged position in being able to source the information required to make an informed decision, to take that decision, then to lead? And I'm not sure I'm in a position to answer it tonight, but I prefer leaders over followers. And you're right, the American president made some promises he couldn't keep, particularly around inputs to production and manufacturing, which of course suddenly had tariffs imposed on them. But the Australian situation is quite different. There's a lot of mythology around this. Thermal coal is still responsible for 60% of the world's electricity production. And the big emitters, and those coming out of developing states like India, will consume a lot of thermal coal for a long, long time to come. And I think Australia will be exporting thermal coal for at least 30 years and probably longer. And our thermal coal is relatively clean and efficient. I mean, some on the left don't like us saying that, but it's just a fact. Secondly, 60% of our coal exports by value represent metallurgical coal. And it's not steaming coal. And demand for that will be strong even longer. If you want China and India to further modernise, they'll need steel. And they'll need thermal coal to move to a wealthier modern economy. And they'll be sucking up our resources for a long, long time. The other myth is this idea that coal mines are having difficulty raising capital. It's rubbish. And sometimes that mythology itself comes from the coal mining company as a strategy in the market. It can affect supply and demand if you're casting doubt over investment certainty. So I wouldn't take too much interest in that. So I think the US-Australia thing is not a fair comparison. And the coal mining industry will remain strong for a long, long time to come. And remember, it takes 200 tonnes of coking coal, metallurgical coal, to build one wind turbine. So if you want India and China to further modernise, they'll need lots of coking coal, they'll need lots of thermal coal to build things like solar panels if they're going to make their way.
So we're getting close to the end. There's a question here.
Hello, my name's Hilma Els. You've partly answered the first part of my question by that last one. I was going to ask, how do you reconcile our reliance for 40% of the value of our exports on coal, as I understand it, both steaming and coking coal? How does that? How can we be goody two-shoes in the international world if we're still doing that? Which leads me to my second part, which is I wish to actually hear your views on the future of Australia, how we can become smarter rather than relying on these old economies that we've been relying on for too long, I believe.
Yeah. Well, I don't completely agree with your numbers on the exports, but your point is well made. My first response is the one I made here, the bill. I think we're morally right to do that because we're lifting those economies out of developing status. But our resources sector is much bigger than that. Many of the minerals we produce are high-value minerals. Rare earths now will becoming increasingly important. But your point is still well made. We are overly dependent on the resources sector. There is no doubt about that. Someone put out some rankings this week that suggested that we've fallen significantly down the scale in terms of our complexity as an economy. And when you think about the great inventions of the world, the satellites, the internet, the coding that goes with them, I did some research on this. They were all initiated or would not have come into play if it hadn't been in the absence of government grants or government's assistance. I think government in Australia has a role to play in accelerating innovation. We fell into that area where it's all free market and the private sector will do that. But the fact is the government does have a role to play. And I think the Australian government needs at some point to get smarter about that. We need to diversify further our economy.
Finally, Michael Forshaw.
Thanks, Joel. I'll just take you to your closing comments of your address where you talked about globalism and isolationism. And you also mentioned Brexit and Trump. I ask you as a former Minister of the Defence, and I appreciate the restrictions that might apply now as you're not the Shadow Minister in that area. But
doesn't usually worry me, Michael. Well,
I thought I could probably throw in a question. But given what's happening with Brexit, Russia, Turkey, Iran, Trump's sort of stance on defence and foreign policy with the EU, it seems like though it's fracturing, it's a mess. I'd just like if you maybe comment on, you know, the defence and security sort of forecast, if you like, for where all this is going at the moment, because when you were the Minister for Defence, whatever pressures were there was a lot of cooperation, particularly say in Afghanistan and the fight against terrorism and so on. But it's very, very hard to read the situation today as to where this is all going to end up.
Yeah. Well, what keeps awake at night every strategic thinker and planner is the prospect of the US withdrawing from the Indo-Pacific. When I used to attend the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore, all that mattered to all the delegates from around the region was the Americans turning up and reassuring everyone they're here to stay. And I saw the Admiral in charge of PACOM say that this week, which is reassuring. But, you know, it's not impossible to believe that sometime over the next 30, 40, 50 years, or even sooner, the way some of our global leaders are behaving, to believe that the US could withdraw. They're big enough, they have enough population, enough critical mass, a big enough economy, and enough military capability to keep themselves safe for another 300 years. They don't have to be here. And we have to ask ourselves what sort of region we would live in if the US withdrew. And thankfully that's not going to happen anytime soon, and hopefully it will never happen. But we do need a more independent foreign policy. And China will continue to grow in importance to us in both economic and strategic terms. And we should not be sitting next to the US President as a Prime Minister while he declares China to be a threat to international security. It's not the way for Australia, and we need to do a lot more hard thinking about that.
Many thanks,
Jeremy. Thank you.
There are a lot of people here. There are more comments to come, but we always finish on time, and we're going to do that again tonight. Thanks to Joel Fitzgibbon for a great performance at the Sydney Institute. A very thoughtful speech, but also a provocative speech, which has already created a lot of interest and will continue to do so for some time to come, I imagine. But we'd love to have you back again. And but for tonight, well done. Thank you.